A woman is arrested following the St. Petersburg bomb blast that killed pro-Kremlin blogger Vladlen Tatarsky, Interfax reports.
All eyes are on Ursula von der Leyen's joint trip with Emmanuel Macron to China, at a time when relations between the two are at a crossroads.
Donald Trump returns to New York to appear before a Manhattan judge. He's the first former US president ever to face criminal charges.
A woman has been arrested following the St. Petersburg cafe bomb blast that killed pro-Kremlin blogger Vladlen Tatarsky, Interfax news agency reports. Tatarsky was speaking at a public meeting in the cafe on Sunday when the bomb went off, injuring 30. Eyewitnesses said that shortly before the blast, he had placed a bust of himself on a nearby table.
Ему якобы какая-то покойница подарила подарок, статуэтку. Все. Ну и после этого через там, может быть, 3-5 минут, я не знаю точно, произошел взрыв. Что сказать?
Tatarsky had more than 560,000 followers on Telegram. Unlike many other commentators, he frequently visited the front line. While backing the war, he criticized the generals running it, and a Ukrainian government official blamed his death on internal divisions, saying spiders are eating each other in a jar.
The first Polish MiG-29 fighter jets have arrived in Ukraine, Warsaw confirmed on Monday, without specifying exactly how many aircraft have been sent. Last month, Poland and Slovakia became the first Western countries to announce the shipment of more than 40 MiG fighters to Ukraine, thereby crossing what was until then a red line in sending military equipment to the country. The announcement comes ahead of Ukrainian President Zelensky's visit to Warsaw on Wednesday for his first official trip to Poland since the war began. Meanwhile, German Vice-Chancellor Robert Habeck arrived in Kyiv for an unannounced visit.
Dass die Ukraine ein klares Zeichen kriegt, dass wir daran glauben, dass sie siegreich sein wird, dass sie wieder aufgebaut wird, dass es ein Interesse von Europa gibt, nicht nur in der Not zu unterstützen, sondern dass die Ukraine auch ein wirtschaftlich starker Partner in der Zukunft sein wird.
Habeck, who also serves as economy minister, was accompanied by a small business delegation. The main purpose of this trip is to discuss the reconstruction of the country and cooperation in the energy sector.
Russian, Ukrainian and Western sources observe that Russian winter offensive has failed to achieve the Kremlin's goal of seizing the Donetsk and Luhansk region administrative borders by the end of March. Deputy head of the main directorate of the Russian National Guard, Rosgvardia, in occupied Donetsk region noted that failures during the offensive spark negative sentiments among personnel and cause manpower losses. Now, the UK Defence Ministry states while Russia has suffered up to 200,000 casualties since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a significant minority of this have been due to non-combat causes, which likely include poor weapon handling drills, road traffic accidents and climatic injuries such as hypothermia, it's said. Russian commanders likely identify pervasive alcohol abuse as particularly detrimental to combat effectiveness. Russian forces continued to attack Bakhmut and its environs. The Institute for the Study of War says they likely seized the Azom plant in northern Bakhmut, as the think tank has previously assessed. Ukrainian forces conducted a missile strike on the plant on the 2nd of April. Wagner Group founder Yevgeny Prigozhin said his troops had raised a Russian flag on the city's administrative building. Following his latest claims, Ukraine has said Russian forces are very far from capturing the eastern town of Bakhmut and that fighting raged around the city administration building where the Wagner mercenary group claims to have raised the Russian flag. Now, Russian mill bloggers fretted that Russian forces must finish their offensive operations in Bakhmut and Avdiivka to prepare for the Ukrainian counteroffensives that they expect between the Orthodox East on the 16th of April and the Soviet Victory Day on the 9th of May.
The announcement by the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC+, that it plans to cut production has sent oil prices soaring by nearly 6%. sparking fears of further inflation. The consortium has signalled it will cut oil production by more than 1 million barrels a day. It says the aim is to stabilise prices, but analysts say there were two main factors in global market conditions.
The financial crisis or the banking crisis that started in the US over the past 2-3 weeks and in Europe with Credit Suisse, I think has increased the possibilities of the developed economies of going into a recession faster and sooner than people have thought, and maybe for longer. The second main reason, in my view, is that the China reopening, where everybody was expecting China is going to rebound in terms of the economic demand, is slower than expected.
The announcement comes as governments around the world are still struggling to combat persistently high inflation. It had fallen in some Western countries recently, partly because of lower energy prices. A fresh rebound in the price of oil could reverse that trend and force central banks that may have been considering easing interest rates to think again.
Following calls by the European Commission to reassess EU diplomatic and economic ties with China, all eyes are now on Ursula von der Leyen's joint trip with the French president to Beijing, where the stakes could not be higher. In 2022, China was the third largest partner for EU goods exports and the largest partner for the bloc's imports of goods, an important indicator of where relations between the two really lie. For some experts, this trip will be exploited by Chinese President Xi Jinping.
We have the biggest players, such as Germany or France, and the business circles in these two countries have very vast, really vast interests in terms of returning to business as usual. And with Macron, this business delegation is definitely a signal towards Beijing that economic cooperation is still very high on the agenda in Paris. But also, at the level of EU as a whole, and this was very visible in von der Leyen's speech, Europe is not about decoupling, this American-style decoupling.
Von der Leyen has described it as de-risking rather than decoupling, but Bakulska says this won't be easy.
But this will be very, very difficult in practice, given the scope of Xi Jinping's revisionism, the way how economy has been politicized in the recent decade, and also given his ambitions, create this dependency to also shield China from external shock.
Macron wants to deter China from getting even closer to Russia, but some analysts warn that there's not much room to maneuver given that the nature of relations between Beijing and Moscow is highly strategic. What the French president and his European Commission counterpart can do is warn China of possible consequences in case of further military support to Russia.
President Macron, of course, has the legitimacy to ask and raise the issue to China for two reasons. First, France is, of course, a nuclear weapon state. And second, France, unlike the US and the UK, is not part of any nuclear sharing agreement as these two countries are as part of NATO. France, compared to China, is lightweight today. Even though France is a permanent member of the Security Council, the relationship is very asymmetric, and there is little that Macron can convince Xi Jinping of. It's good to try. It's good, of course, to maintain channel of communication open, but we need to be very realistic in our expectation and to keep very limited expectation.
At the same time, both experts agree that sensitive technologies are key to this relationship. But this doesn't mean that China has the upper hand, as China is still an export powerhouse and is very much dependent on maintaining these exports and having access to European markets.
Donald Trump's unprecedented date with justice has turned into a media circus. The former US president left his Mar-a-Lago, Florida estate for the airport, followed by a crowd of cameras and cheered on by his supporters. On Tuesday, he will stand before a Manhattan court, charged in connection with the alleged hush money payment he made to porn star Stormy Daniels. His flight touched down in New York just after 3:30 local time. The 2024 presidential candidate will spend the night in Trump Tower, where there is a major security presence. The surrounding streets have been cordoned off due to fears of protests getting heated. On the streets of New York, public reaction to the prosecution was split.
I think the country is very divided at this point, so I think it's important that we understand that this is not about sides, it's about justice.
indicting him on a hooker's payment 10 years ago or 7 years ago is a misdemeanor, and it should not be a felony case.
This is the first time in history that a former US president faces criminal charges. Trump has called the New York District Attorney's office corrupt and claims that the judge overseeing Tuesday's hearing, quote, hates him. The wait is finally over. US space agency NASA has revealed the chosen astronauts who will be on the next mission to orbit the moon. American astronauts Christina Cook, Victor Glover and Reed Wiseman and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen will make up the team of the Artemis 2 mission, the first crew trip to orbit the moon in 50 years. Cook will become the first female astronaut on a lunar mission, while Glover becomes the first African American. If all goes well, it will leave Earth on November 2024. The mission is expected to take the crew 10 days. The astronauts will spend most of the time in an Orion capsule, which will detach from the rocket once in space and circle the moon before returning to Earth and landing in the ocean. The mission will pave the way for Artemis 3, which will launch in 2025 with the intention of landing on the moon. The Artemis program is seeking to provide a foundation for deep space exploration and to test the ability to safely return humans to the moon and other planets such as Mars.